I still remember the first time I realized I was living in someone else's shadow. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, not a dramatic moment where the clouds parted and lightning struck. It was quieter than that, softer but sharper, like a paper cut you don't notice until it stings. It came in the form of a smile, one of those smiles parents save for the child who shines brightest in their eyes. Except that child wasn't me. From as early as I can remember, my brother was the center of our household. The golden child, the one who could do no wrong. His drawings were hung on the refrigerator like priceless works of art, even when the stick figures wobbled and the colors bled outside the lines. When he spoke, everyone listened, leaning in as if wisdom dripped from his young mouth. And me? My voice faded in the background, an echo swallowed by the walls. At school events, the favoritism was even more blatant. If he ran a race, my parents cheered like he had just won an Olympic medal. If he stumbled, they rushed to comfort him, telling him he was brave for even trying. But when I came home clutching a spelling bee ribbon or a painting I had poured my soul into, the best I could hope for was a distracted, "That's nice, dear." Sometimes not even that. The contrast wasn't only in words, it was in the little things, the things you can't mistake. At dinner, he got the biggest piece of chicken, the slice of cake with the most frosting. When new clothes were bought, his were brand new, while mine were hand-me-downs, slightly frayed at the cuffs, smelling faintly of mothballs. Even toys weren't spared. If he wanted something, he got it, no questions asked. If I asked for something, I was told to be practical, to learn the value of sacrifice. I used to sit at the corner of the living room, watching the scene unfold like a play where I had been cast as an extra. My brother would sit cross-legged on the rug, showing off some half-finished Lego tower. My parents' faces glowed with pride, their voices warm and thick with praise. "Look at that, so talented, so smart," they would say, as though he had just engineered a skyscraper. I would sit quietly, clutching the book I was reading or the sketch pad I had filled with careful lines, waiting for someone to notice. They rarely did. It's a peculiar kind of pain, being invisible in your own home. The walls you live in, the roof that shelters you, they all remind you of your place. Second, lesser, forgotten. When relatives visited, the favoritism doubled. "Oh, he's going to be someone great," they'd gush, ruffling my brother's hair, their eyes sparkling with admiration. Then they would glance at me, force a smile, and say, "And you must be so proud of him too." Not proud of myself. Proud of him. Always him. I can't count the number of times I swallowed my words. I wanted to say, "Look at me too. See what I can do. See who I am." But I didn't, because deep down, I had already learned that my achievements would never be enough. No matter how high my grades, how hard I tried, I could never climb out from under the long shadow cast by my brother's golden glow. There were nights I cried quietly into my pillow, muffling the sound so no one would hear. Crying felt dangerous, like it would expose my weakness. My parents had no patience for what they called drama, so I learned to be quiet, to hide my hurt behind a smile, to carry my pain like a secret folded inside my chest. And yet, as much as I tried to bury it, resentment grew, roots digging deeper each time I was overlooked, each time I was told to be understanding. The irony was cruel. I was the understanding one, the responsible one, the dependable one. I picked up the slack when chores were forgotten, when homework was neglected. I learned early how to cook, how to clean, how to make myself useful. My brother, he was shielded, excused, even praised for things that weren't his doing. If he broke something, it was an accident. If I made the smallest mistake, it was carelessness. The scales were always tipped, and I was the weight that never mattered. One memory still burns in me. It was my birthday. I had turned 10, an age that felt monumental. I had secretly hoped that for once I would be the star, that the day would belong to me. I remember waking up to the smell of cake, my heart swelling with anticipation. But when I came downstairs, the living room was decorated in balloons for my brother. "We decided to celebrate both of you together," my mother explained. Except the cake had his name written in icing, the gifts piled high at his feet. while mine was a single sweater 2 sizes too big. I smiled, said thank you, pretended not to notice. But inside, something broke. Birthdays are supposed to make you feel special. That day only confirmed that I never would be. And yet, through it all, I kept trying. Maybe, I thought, if I worked harder, if I shined brighter, they would finally see me. I stayed late in the library, earned top marks, collected certificates like armor. Every achievement I stacked up felt like a plea. Notice me. Acknowledge me. Love me the way you love him. But no matter how tall my pile grew, it was always overshadowed by even the smallest pebble of his accomplishments. He could bring home a half-completed project, and they would marvel at his genius. I could bring home a gold medal, and they would say, "That's expected from you." The message was clear. His successes were miracles. Mine were obligations. As I grew older, the weight of exclusion pressed harder. I began to see the long-term pattern, the structure of it. This wasn't just about favoritism in daily life. It was about shaping us into roles. He, the heir, the chosen one. Me, the shadow, the supporter, the one meant to step aside. It wasn't just what they did. It was what they believed. And that belief seeped into every crack of my existence, making me question my worth, my place, my right to even dream. The cruelest part? My brother wasn't blind. He knew. He basked in their affection like sunlight, but he also saw the way they ignored me. Sometimes he used it against me. A smirk when I was scolded, a casual reminder that he was the favorite. "They just love me more," he'd whisper when no one was around. And though I wanted to hate him, I couldn't. Because it wasn't just his fault. It was theirs. They built this imbalance, and we both lived in its shadow. One of us warmed, the other frozen. Over time, I learned to carry myself differently. If I couldn't be celebrated, I would be silent. If I couldn't be included, I would become an observer. That was the role I was assigned, and I played it well. But inside, the hunger never faded. The hunger to be seen, to be valued, to matter. When I look back now, I realize that this was only the beginning, the opening act of a story that would stretch years, filled with betrayals I couldn't yet imagine. At the time, though, all I knew was the ache of invisibility. I was the extra in my own life, the understudy who never got called to the stage. And yet what they didn't know, what I didn't even know at the time, was that living in the shadows sharpens you. It teaches you to see things others miss, to endure what others can't. It teaches you patience, resilience, a quiet kind of strength. The golden child may shine, but shadows have their own power. They grow longer, darker, until they eventually cover everything. That thought stayed with me, buried beneath the hurt, a seed waiting to grow. Because one day, I would no longer be just the shadow. One day, the light they reserved for him would reveal the cracks in their perfect picture. And when that happened, all the years of exclusion, all the years of silence would become the fire that changed everything. For now, though, I waited. I endured. I lived in his glow, in their praise, in the corner where no one looked. But deep, inside, I knew. This story wasn't over. This was only the beginning. If Section 1 was about living in someone else's shadow, this part of my life was about what it meant to hold up the entire house without anyone noticing. Shadows don't just follow. Sometimes they carry weight. And that was my role. The one who carried everything no one else wanted to. I was the dependable child. The one who never asked for much. While my brother lounged on the sofa with video games humming in the background, I was the one setting the table, folding laundry, scrubbing dishes until my hands wrinkled. If my parents were tired, I ran errands. If groceries were needed, I carried the heavy bags home. When bills piled up, I was the one reminded to turn off the lights, save water, cut back. Meanwhile, my brother's bedroom glowed all night like a neon sign, the TV buzzing long after midnight, and no one said a word. The imbalance was so normal, so ingrained, that it began to feel invisible, but only to them. I felt every ounce of it. There were days when I would wake before dawn just to finish chores before school. I'd pack lunches, sweep the kitchen, and feed the pets while my brother slept in. By the time he wandered downstairs, yawning and stretching, like royalty rising from his chamber, breakfast was waiting. My mother would smile at him, pat his hair, and say, "Eat, you need your strength." She never noticed the tired slump of my shoulders, the way my hands smelled faintly of soap. At school, I pushed myself too. Teachers loved me because I was the one who remembered deadlines, who volunteered to help clean the classroom, who stayed behind to stack chairs. But at home, those efforts went unnoticed. My brother could forget his homework, and my parents would blame the teacher for being too strict. If I scored a 98 on a test, they would ask, "Why not 100?" The message was clear. My sacrifices were expectations. His bare minimum was extraordinary. I can still see one afternoon burned into my memory. My brother wanted a new bicycle. Not just any bike, but the flashy, expensive one all his friends had. I watched as my parents discussed it at the dinner table, their voices warm with indulgence. "He deserves it," my father said. "He's been working so hard." Working hard? He hadn't lifted a finger in weeks. Meanwhile, I had been saving coins in a jar for months, hoping to buy myself a used backpack because mine was falling apart. When I asked if they could help me with the cost, my mother shook her head. "We can't spend money on unnecessary things." The next week, the shiny bike arrived, a red gleaming symbol of everything I wasn't worth. The humiliation of it was sharp, but sharper still was the silence I was expected to keep. I wasn't allowed to complain. If I so much as hinted at unfairness, I was told I was jealous, dramatic, or ungrateful. "You should be happy for your brother," they'd say, as though my only role in life was to clap for his victories while burying my own disappointments. So I stayed quiet, and I worked harder. There was always something that needed doing, and somehow, it always landed on me. If the house needed cleaning before guests arrived, I was the one on my knees scrubbing the floor. If something broke, I was handed the glue, the tape, the responsibility. My brother was never asked, never expected. He floated through the days untethered while I was anchored to duty. And yet, what stung the most wasn't the work itself. It was how invisible it all was. No one thanked me. No one even noticed. If the house looked tidy, it was assumed my mother had done it. If my brother found clean clothes in his drawer, he thought they had magically appeared. My efforts dissolved into the air, unacknowledged, unseen. There's a loneliness in that kind of invisibility, a hollowness that grows inside you. I started to question myself. Maybe I was only valuable for what I could provide. Maybe love was conditional, earned through service, not given freely. Maybe I wasn't meant to be celebrated, only used. Still, I kept sacrificing. Birthdays? I gave him my share of cake when he wanted more. Holidays? I gave up gifts saying I didn't need anything, so my parents could afford what he wanted. When I got my first part-time job, I handed over my paycheck for groceries, for bills. "You're so responsible," my father said, not with pride, but with expectation, as though responsibility was my natural state, not a choice. My brother's allowance, meanwhile, remained untouched, his money free to be spent on games and gadgets. And yet, every time I thought I had swallowed enough hurt, there came a moment that cut deeper, like the time I stayed up all night sewing a costume for the school play because we couldn't afford one. I stitched until my fingers ached, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. On the night of the performance, my parents arrived late, slipping into the audience just in time to watch my brother deliver a single line on stage. He wasn't even the star. But when the play ended, they rushed to him, showering him with praise. My costume, my effort, my role, forgotten. That was the story of my life. I gave, they took, and he received. But here's the thing about endless sacrifice. It starts planting seeds. At first, they're small, almost invisible. A flicker of resentment when your brother takes the last piece of cake without asking. A pang of anger when your parents beam at him for something you know you did behind the scenes. But seeds grow. And the more I sacrificed, the more those seeds sprouted into something darker. I began to see patterns. My parents weren't just blind. They were deliberate. They didn't forget my efforts by accident. They dismissed them on purpose. It was easier for them to believe that one child was destined for greatness, while the other was built for support. Easier to fit us into neat roles, the golden one and the shadow, the receiver and the giver. One evening, while folding laundry, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My father's voice was low but sharp. "He's our future," he said. "We have to invest in him. Everything depends on it." My mother agreed, her tone firm. "She's strong. She'll manage. She always does." I froze, clutching a stack of shirts in my arms. Strong, manage, always does. Those words weren't compliments. They were excuses. Excuses to deny me care, to deny me recognition, to justify pouring everything into him while leaving me with scraps. That was the first time I realized their favoritism wasn't just about personality or preference. It was a strategy, a choice, a decision to build him up while keeping me in the background. And the cruelest part? They thought I didn't notice. But I did. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. Some betrayals cut quietly, behind closed doors, where no one else can see. But the one that shattered me happened under the warm glow of celebration, with relatives crowding around, laughter spilling from every corner, and glasses raised high. It was supposed to be a day of family unity. Instead, it became the moment. I realized just how invisible I truly was. It began with an invitation. My parents had decided to host a gathering at our house, the kind that drew in cousins, uncles, aunts, and family friends from near and far. The air was thick with roasted food, clinking cutlery, and the hum of old songs playing faintly in the background. Children ran through the hallways, their giggles echoing, while adults gathered in the living room swapping stories of careers, marriages, and fortunes. I had spent the entire morning preparing, sweeping floors, arranging chairs, polishing silverware that hadn't been touched in months. My brother, of course, had only been tasked with looking presentable, which meant he slept late and rolled out of bed minutes before the guests arrived. I wore my neatest clothes, hoping maybe, just maybe, someone would notice the effort I had put in. I wanted to belong, to be part of the warmth that seemed reserved for everyone else. At first, the day unfolded the way these gatherings always did. The relatives swarmed around my brother, their voices full of admiration. "He's grown so tall." "Such a fine young man." They asked about his studies, his future plans, the things he wanted to accomplish. Their questions wrapped around him like garlands. When they looked at me, their words were polite but hollow, the kind you say out of obligation. "You're helping your mother, aren't you?" Helping. Always helping, never shining. But then, as the evening stretched and the dishes were cleared, my father tapped a spoon against his glass. The chatter quieted. Eyes turned toward him. My mother stood beside him, her face glowing with pride, her hand resting lightly on my brother's shoulder. I stood a few steps away, balancing an empty tray I had been collecting cups with, unaware that my world was about to tilt. "Family," my father began, his voice strong, steady. "We have an announcement to make." The room leaned in. I remember the flutter of anticipation in my chest, a fragile hope that maybe, just this once, the recognition would be mine. Maybe they would thank me for all I had done, all I had carried quietly. Maybe they would finally let me step out of the shadows. But then the words fell, heavy and final. "We have decided that the family property, the house, the land, the savings we've worked for, will all be passed down to our son." My father's hand tightened on my brother's shoulder. "He is our pride, our future. We want everyone here to know that he will carry on our legacy." The room erupted in applause, smiles, nods, raised glasses. My brother's chest swelled with pride as he accepted their congratulations, shaking hands, basking in the glow that had always belonged to him. My mother kissed his cheek, her eyes glistening with joy. "And me?" I stood frozen, the tray trembling in my hands, my smile plastered, in place like a mask. Not a single word had been said about me, not a mention of my efforts, my sacrifices, my existence. The announcement wasn't just about inheritance, it was a declaration, a public erasure of my worth. The humiliation burned hotter than fire. I felt every pair of eyes that slid past me, some with pity, some with indifference, most with approval. They had all accepted it. He was the chosen one, and I was the forgotten. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never resurface. As I stood there, my brother's laughter cutting through the air like glass. Memories of every overlooked moment came rushing back. Every time I had been told to be understanding, every time my achievements had been dismissed, every chore, every sacrifice, every late night, every early morning. It had all led here, to this public stage, where my role was reduced to background silence. What hurt the most wasn't even the decision itself. It was the way it was announced, as though it were a celebration, as though my exclusion were a matter of pride. My parents hadn't just overlooked me, they had erased me with witnesses. They had confirmed to the world what they had always believed in private. I was not part of the legacy. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the laughter had faded into echoes, I lingered in the kitchen, scrubbing plates with shaking hands. My brother strutted past, his new role like a crown on his head. "Guess it's official," he said, smirking. "I'm the future. You're just you." My throat tightened, but I said nothing. There was nothing to say. My parents passed by too, their voices low but warm. "We're so proud of him," my mother whispered. My father agreed, his tone full of certainty. "He'll take care of everything one day." Not once did they look at me. Not once did they notice the hurt etched across my face, the way my hands gripped the sponge until it crumbled. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment again and again. The clinking glass, the applause, the pride in their voices, and each time the sting grew sharper. This wasn't neglect anymore. This was something deeper, something deliberate. Until then, I had convinced myself that maybe they didn't see my worth because they were distracted, because my brother was louder, flashier. But now I understood that they saw exactly what they wanted to. They had chosen him, and by choosing him, they had unchosen me. The humiliation of that realization didn't fade with sleep. It hardened. By morning, it had transformed into something heavier, a gnawing need to know why. Why was I the expendable one? Why was he the golden child? What was it they weren't telling me? And so, for the first time, my pain shifted into curiosity. If they could erase me so easily in public, what were they hiding in private? The applause of that night still echoed in my ears, but beneath it pulsed a new determination. I would no longer settle for scraps of affection. I would find the truth they thought I would never look for. After the family gathering, the house no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage where a play had already been written, a script where my part was nothing more than silence. My parents had spoken their truth in front of everyone. The legacy belonged to my brother. Yet the way they had done it, the pride, the finality, left me unsettled. It was too sharp, too rehearsed, almost as though it had been a performance meant not just for the guests but for me, and that was when the whispers began. At first they were small things, easy to dismiss. A door shutting quickly when I walked into the hallway. A sudden pause in conversation when I entered the living room. The shuffle of papers on the dining table swept away before I could glance at them. Each moment on its own was nothing. But, together, they formed a pattern that whispered of something hidden. One evening, I passed by my parents' bedroom and heard their voices, low and urgent. I wasn't trying to listen, but the tone pulled me in. "We have to be careful," my mother said. "He can't know," my father replied. "Not yet." The word struck me like a stone. Who couldn't know? What secret required such secrecy? My hand hovered over the doorknob for a second, then fell back. I crept away before they could hear me. but the question burned in my chest all night. Were they talking about me? The next morning, I noticed how my parents avoided my gaze more than usual. When they spoke to me, their words were clipped, transactional. Pass the salt. Wash those dishes. Close the window. No warmth, no conversation. Yet, when they spoke to my brother, their tone softened, their faces lit up with ease. I started paying attention, watching, listening, and what I saw only deepened the unease. My brother received letters, thick envelopes with official seals that he quickly tucked away. Once I saw my father hand him a folder, his expression serious, his hand lingering on my brother's shoulder. When I entered the room, both of them froze. The folder vanished under a pile of newspapers, and their words shifted into meaningless, small talk. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was nothing. But then came the night that erased all doubt. It was late, long after the lights were supposed to be out. I was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when I heard voices drifting from the study. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling onto the dark hallway. My parents were inside, along with an uncle who often visited. "So, it's finalized?" my uncle asked. "Yes," my father replied. "Everything will go to him. That's the plan." "And the other one?" My uncle's voice lowered. Silence. Then my mother spoke, her words sharp, certain. "We've made our choice. He'll understand or he won't. Either way, it doesn't matter." The blood drained from my face. They weren't even saying my name, just the other one. That was who I was to them. An afterthought. A shadow. Pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding so loud I feared they would hear it. My uncle muttered something about fairness, but my father dismissed it. "It's what's best for the family. We have to protect the future." The future. Their future, not mine. I slipped away before I could hear more, but the damage was done. I couldn't pretend anymore. Something deliberate was happening, something far larger than mere favoritism. From that night on, my curiosity sharpened into obsession. I began searching, quietly, carefully, for answers. When the house was empty, I checked drawers, cabinets, anywhere they might keep important papers. Most of the time I found nothing but bills and old receipts. But every so often I stumbled on hints, an envelope addressed to a lawyer, a bank statement with only my brother's name, notes scribbled in my father's handwriting about transfers, and beneficiaries. Each discovery was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, but I knew they belonged to the same picture. I just couldn't see it yet. Meanwhile, the whispers continued. I caught relatives exchanging glances when I walked into a room. Once I overheard two aunts whispering in the kitchen. "It isn't fair," one said softly. "Shh," the other replied. "It's not our place." And when they noticed me, they smiled too brightly and changed the subject. Confusion wrapped itself around me like a fog. Why? Why was I being erased so deliberately? Why was my brother the only one who mattered? I had lived in his shadow all my life, but this was different. This was intentional. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. My brother walked taller, smugger, as though he already knew the outcome of a game I hadn't even been invited to play. He dropped hints in his careless way. "Some of us have bigger responsibilities," he'd say, smirking. Or, "Not everyone is cut out to handle the future." I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but I held back. If I showed my hand too soon, they would only bury the truth deeper. So I waited, watched, listened, and then came the moment I had been waiting for. It happened on a quiet afternoon. The house was still, my parents out visiting relatives, my brother asleep upstairs. I was cleaning the study, my usual role always, tidying, always invisible, when I noticed the corner of an envelope peeking out from beneath a stack of books on the desk. Something about it felt different, official, heavy. I pulled it free. The envelope was thick, sealed with a legal stamp. My hands trembled as I slid the papers out. The first line stole the air from my lungs. Last will and testament. I scanned the pages, my eyes racing, my breath shallow. It was all there, in black and white. Every asset, every property, every ounce of savings, assigned to my brother. His name, written again and again, while mine was nowhere. Not a mention, not a token, not a single acknowledgement. The words blurred as my vision stung with tears. I gripped the pages so tightly they crumpled beneath my fingers. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This was a decision carved into law, signed and witnessed. My parents hadn't just chosen him, they had erased me officially, legally, permanently. And yet, even through the ache, a strange clarity broke through. For the first time, the fog lifted. All the whispers, all the secrecy, all the looks, they had been protecting this truth. They hadn't wanted me to find it. They thought I would stay blind, obedient, silent. But now I knew. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was written on paper, stamped and sealed. I slid the will back into its envelope, tucking it exactly where I had found it. My hands still shook, but my mind felt sharper than it ever had before. The pain was still there, raw and heavy, but beneath it pulsed something stronger, determination. If they thought this discovery would break me, they were wrong, because now the game had changed, and I was no longer content to live in whispers. The day I found the will, the world shifted. It was as if the ground beneath my feet had cracked open, and the house I thought I knew collapsed into rubble. Until then, betrayal had been emotional, favoritism, humiliation, whispers in the dark. Painful, yes, but intangible. This document, though turned shadows into substance, it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was proof. The paper in my hands had spoken with cold precision. Every line, every signature, every official seal carried the weight of finality. The assets were not mine. The property was not mine. The savings, the business, the future, none of it had ever been mine. It was all his, my brother's, and my name. It was missing, as if I had never existed. I stared at those pages until the words blurred into nothing but black lines. Somewhere in the background, the clock ticked with cruel steadiness. I wanted to tear the document apart, to shred it into pieces, but I didn't. Destroying the evidence would not erase the truth. It would only rob me of the one weapon I had managed to uncover. So I folded it carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and returned it to the pile where I had found it. My hands trembled as though I had touched fire, but inside me something else was stirring. Clarity. For so long, I had clung to illusions. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe my parents did love me in their own quiet way. Maybe I just needed to be patient. But that will killed every illusion. My family had not simply overlooked me. They had not simply failed to value me. They had made a decision, deliberate and legal, to erase me. That truth cut deeper than every cruel word, every act of favoritism, every public humiliation. And yet, as much as it hurt, I couldn't look away. In the days that followed, I saw everything differently. The house felt smaller, colder. Every smile my parents gave my brother, every approving nod, every casual dismissal of me, they weren't just everyday interactions anymore. They were symptoms of a plan that had been in place for years. I thought back to moments that hadn't made sense at the time. The way my father had spent endless evenings showing my brother the family accounts, while I was told to stay out of the room. The way my mother boasted about his achievements to relatives, while mine were brushed aside with polite silence. The envelopes my brother received, the hushed conversations, the glances exchanged when I entered the room, pieces of a puzzle that, once complete, revealed the whole ugly picture. They hadn't been grooming him for the future out of love alone. They had been preparing him because the future belonged entirely to him. And they had kept me in the dark because, to them, I wasn't part of that future. Anger grew inside me like a fire I could no longer control. It burned hot, then cold, then hot again. At first, it consumed me with fury. How could they do this? How could the people who raised me decide that I didn't matter, not even enough to leave me a token acknowledgement? But soon the anger shifted. It became sharper, less chaotic. A weapon, not a wound. Because now I understood the game. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about affection. It wasn't even about who was the better child. It was about power, about control, about ensuring that their chosen heir, the golden child, stood on top, while I remained beneath. And the truth they had tried to bury was now mine to carry. I began moving carefully, quietly. No one could know that I had seen the will. If they suspected, they would hide it somewhere else, erase every trace. So I wore the mask they expected, the dutiful, overlooked child. I nodded, I obeyed, I pretended not to notice when decisions were made without me. But behind the mask, I was watching. When my parents spoke in low voices behind closed doors, I lingered outside longer than before, memorizing fragments. When my brother carelessly left his folders on the desk, I glanced at them quickly, noting names of lawyers, banks, and firms. When relatives exchanged knowing looks, I met their eyes just long enough to make them nervous, just long enough to let them wonder how much I knew. Each day I gathered pieces. Each night I put them together. Slowly, painfully, the picture became clearer. There were bank transfers made in my brother's name years before I had even noticed. Investments signed over to him without anyone mentioning it. Land registered solely under his name, though the family had always spoken as though it belonged to us all. It was systematic. Not a single oversight, not a mistake, but a strategy carried out with precision. My parents had built an entire future for him while constructing a silence for me. And the worst part? Everyone knew. The relatives who avoided my gaze, the friends of the family who clapped my brother on the back and called him the future. They had all seen the truth long before I had, and not one of them had said a word. That realization was another kind of betrayal. It wasn't just my parents. It was a network of silence, a conspiracy of complicity. There were moments when the weight of it nearly crushed me. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if maybe this was my fate. Maybe some people were simply born to be forgotten. Maybe I had been a fool all along, hoping for a place at a table that had never been meant for me. But despair never lasted long. Every time I felt it creep in, anger rose to meet it. Anger reminded me that I was not weak. Anger reminded me that I had survived every slight, every humiliation, every dismissal. And anger whispered that survival wasn't enough anymore. They had written me out of their story. But I still had a pen. One evening, as I walked past the study, I saw my father hunched over his desk, reviewing documents. I paused in the shadows, my heart steady, my breath quiet. From where I stood, I could see the papers spread out before him. Deeds, contracts, more transfers. He was tying up loose ends, strengthening the cage they had built around me. For a long moment, I watched him. The man who had raised me, the man I had once believed would protect me, was calmly dismantling my future with the stroke of a pen. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I wasn't just a neglected child anymore. I wasn't just a victim. I was someone who knew the truth, and with truth came power. The betrayal had reached its peak. It wasn't only about money or property or recognition. It was about existence itself. They had tried to bury me, to write me out, to make me invisible. But in uncovering their secret, I had pulled myself out of the grave they had dug. Yes, the pain was unbearable. Yes, the anger burned hotter than ever. But beneath it all, I felt something new, something steady and unshakable. Determination. They thought the will was the end of my story, but it was only the beginning. I didn't know yet how I would fight, or what weapons I would use, but I knew this. I would no longer be silent. I would no longer accept invisibility. They had buried the truth deep, but I had unearthed it. And now, with the truth in my hands, I would begin my quiet rebellion, because the story wasn't theirs to write anymore. It was mine. After uncovering the will and seeing the deliberate plan my parents had put in place, I realized that the loudest reactions wouldn't serve me. Anger, shouting, confrontation. These were weapons my family wielded better than I ever could. My brother thrived on drama. My parents craved attention and control. Any outward display of emotion would only reinforce the narrative they had constructed. The dutiful shadow, frustrated and powerless. So I decided on silence. Not passive silence, but the kind that masks sharp observation and strategic calculation. I moved through the house like a ghost, performing my expected duties with precision. I cooked the meals, folded the laundry, answered questions with polite brevity, all while my mind cataloged, assessed, and planned. Every smile I gave my brother, every nod to my parents was a mask, a carefully crafted illusion of submission. The contrast was striking. My brother strutted through the house like a king, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing beneath his nose. My parents, smug and self-satisfied, seemed to believe they had cemented their victory, and in a way they had, on the surface. But beneath it all, patience and observation became my weapons. I studied patterns. How my brother behaved when he thought no one was looking. How my parents distributed their attention. When documents were left unattended. How neighbors and relatives reacted to subtle comments. Every interaction was a lesson, a piece of intelligence I could use later. Some nights I would sit in my room long after everyone else had gone to bed, replaying conversations in my head. Why does he get everything? I whispered to myself. Not as a question, but as a challenge. I imagined scenarios, small experiments. How would they react if I did something unexpected? If I withheld effort? If I subtly reminded them that I too had power, even if it was hidden? I became meticulous. If my brother left his tablet charging in the living room, I noted it. If my parents left legal papers unattended, I memorized their positions and contents without touching a thing. I learned to move silently through the house, listening for subtle cues that would indicate weakness or opportunity. Externally, I was the obedient child, the invisible one. I smiled when praised for chores, nodded when asked to run errands, offered help before it was requested. But internally, I was building a web of knowledge, carefully mapping the vulnerabilities my family revealed with each careless action. The irony was delicious, even in the quiet moments. My brother's arrogance was at its peak. He boasted about winning the family's favor, acting as though he had earned what had been handed to him. My parents' smugness reinforced the illusion of their control, but I could see through. At every moment of pride, every careless laugh, every indulgent comment, they were all cracks. And I was watching, memorizing, waiting. Patience became my closest ally. I learned that the smallest gestures often held the greatest meaning. A glance, a pause in speech, a shift in tone. These subtle signals spoke louder than any overt statement. I read my family like a book, each chapter revealing more about their desires, fears, and blind spots. The act of quiet endurance was not easy. Some days the resentment swelled so high that I felt it might spill over, erupting in anger or tears. But I reminded myself that control was power. Impulse would only weaken me. Every act of restraint was a seed planted for future leverage. I also began experimenting in subtle ways, small deviations from expectations. Finishing a chore a bit later than usual, asking a question with slightly more curiosity than required, maintaining eye contact a fraction longer when they looked past me. These tiny shifts didn't alert them to suspicion, but they allowed me to test boundaries, measure reactions, and understand the limits of their attention and patience. There were nights when I walked the halls silently, imagining how the future could be reshaped. The will, the documents, the secrecy, they weren't just instruments of betrayal. They were clues. Clues about their priorities, their fears, and, most importantly, the weaknesses in the armor they believed protected my brother. I began to notice patterns in how they celebrated achievements. My brother's successes were always public, visible to everyone. My efforts were private, hidden, and thus undervalued. That was a lesson. Power is often in perception. If I could manipulate perception, even subtly, I could begin to reclaim some measure of influence without alerting them. My family believed that silence was weakness. I decided to make it a weapon. At meals, I observed more than I spoke. I learned who was easily swayed by flattery, who reacted poorly to questions, and who tended to ignore subtleties. These small insights were gold, Each unnoticed gesture, each overlooked detail became part of a strategy forming quietly in my mind. I also began cataloging my own achievements, not for recognition, but for self-empowerment. Every chore, every errand, every hidden effort became a point of pride, a reminder that I was capable of excellence even without praise. My sense of self-worth, once dependent on validation, started to shift inward. Meanwhile, my parents' complacency deepened. They were so convinced of their control, so satisfied with the narrative they had crafted, that they did not notice my quiet transformation. My brother's arrogance blinded him. He saw only the benefits he had been given, never suspecting that the child he thought invisible was quietly observing, learning, and planning. The contrast between my internal state and the external facade was stark. Outside, I played the obedient shadow. Inside, I was a strategist, a quiet force building strength with each passing day. Where they saw weakness, I was cultivating patience. Where they saw passivity, I was gathering knowledge. Where they believed the future was secure in their hands, I was slowly plotting a reclamation. Every day the sense of control grew within me. Every overlooked document, every whispered conversation, every careless action by my family reinforced the knowledge that they underestimated me. And in underestimation lies opportunity. I had become a silent storm, invisible to their eyes, but not to my mind. And like all storms, I knew the moment would come when restraint would turn into action, patience into momentum, observation into influence. The quiet before the storm was long and testing. I had to endure, to resist the urge for immediate confrontation. Every moment of silence was a promise to myself. I would not be beaten by favoritism or smugness. I would not allow their deliberate erasure to define my worth. Instead, I would strike in ways they could not anticipate. I would act with precision, using every detail, every observation, every small victory of understanding to reshape the narrative. And though the world outside continued with its ordinary noise, inside me, a storm was gathering. One day, my silence would no longer be misinterpreted as weakness. One day, they would see the force that had been quietly building all along. Until then, I waited. I watched. I learned. The house was theirs on the surface, the legacy theirs to parade. But beneath the polished floors and well-arranged furniture, the invisible force was growing, patient, deliberate, and ready. My family believed that by ignoring me, by controlling perception, by placing everything in my brother's hands, they had secured their power. They were wrong, because patience, knowledge, and quiet endurance are often the most dangerous weapons, and I had all three. After weeks of silent observation, I realized that patience alone wouldn't be enough. Waiting, listening, and learning had given me insight, but insight was only the first step. To reclaim any measure of power, I needed action, even small, calculated action. The storm I had been nurturing in silence was ready to make its first subtle moves. I began with small shifts in my daily routine. Chores, once performed automatically, became opportunities to test boundaries and gather information. I deliberately documented things that had been overlooked for years: receipts, correspondence, minor contracts, anything that hinted at favoritism or mismanagement. Every unnoticed paper, every casual mistake by my parents or brother became a piece of leverage I could use later. One morning, while my brother was preoccupied with his phone, I found an old ledger tucked away in the study desk. It recorded payments my parents had promised him, allowances he received but never mentioned, and purchases they had made in his name. I made a discreet copy of the ledger in my notebook, careful to conceal it where no one would suspect. That single act, small, almost insignificant, was the beginning of my quiet reclamation. Next, I started forging independent success in ways they couldn't control. I had always been careful with money, even when it felt like my efforts were invisible. I applied for a part-time freelance project, one that paid modestly but gave me autonomy. By the time my parents and brother noticed, I was already learning to navigate systems they had dismissed me from. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't obvious, but it was mine, entirely mine. and for the first time, I felt the thrill of accomplishment, not tied to their approval. At family gatherings, I shifted my approach. Rather than fading into the background, I quietly observed opportunities to build alliances with relatives who had long been overlooked, those who had once offered sympathetic glances, hushed whispers, or subtle hints that they noticed the disparity. I struck casual conversations, subtly referencing shared concerns without exposing my knowledge too early. By fostering these small connections, I began building a network of subtle support, a web of quiet empathy that could strengthen my position in the future. Meanwhile, I continued to document evidence of my brother's incompetence. He was careless, overconfident, and prone to mistakes that had been previously excused as charm or luck. Contracts misfiled, bills unpaid, minor responsibilities neglected. These small cracks in his armor slowly accumulated into a pattern. I kept meticulous notes, recording dates, times, and consequences, all without anyone suspecting that I was building a case. The house, once a place where I had felt powerless, was slowly revealing itself as a map of opportunity. Every misstep by my parents, every casual boast by my brother, became a stepping stone. I realized that while they had focused on appearances and favors, they had ignored subtle details, the kind of details that mattered in reality, and that neglect was my advantage. One afternoon, I overheard my brother bragging to a cousin about a decision he had made regarding family finances. His confidence was inflated, his logic flawed, and he didn't notice my quiet presence behind the doorway. I took note of every word, committed it to memory, and later recorded it in my notebook. This wasn't confrontation, it was preparation. Every slip, every boast, every unguarded moment contributed to the small cracks forming in the foundation of his perceived superiority. I also began testing my parents' reactions in subtle ways. A question here, a suggestion there, each carefully designed to probe their rigidity without revealing my intent. I noticed their irritation when I asked about responsibilities that technically fell under my brother's domain. I saw the momentary hesitation when I subtly highlighted tasks that had been neglected. Small, almost invisible, but each one chipped away at the certainty they had built around their golden child. Simultaneously, I cultivated my own voice, using it sparingly but strategically. At family meals, I began to ask thoughtful questions that exposed contradictions in their narratives. Not accusations, just observations delivered casually, almost innocently. The effect was immediate. My parents exchanged brief, uneasy glances, and my brother's confident smirk faltered. I didn't overplay it. The goal was not confrontation yet, but to signal that I was not as passive as they believed. In the weeks that followed, the power dynamics shifted subtly but noticeably. My brother, once untouchable, began to show frustration at my growing awareness. His careless comments were now met with quiet, pointed questions from me. He hesitated before making assumptions, noticing for the first time that I wasn't entirely invisible. Even my parents began to react differently. The smiles of smugness occasionally faltered when I mentioned facts they had assumed I hadn't noticed. The careful planning that had given them such confidence was starting to meet resistance, not through overt rebellion, but through quiet, deliberate observation and clever maneuvering. At first, I questioned myself. Was it enough? Could small incremental shifts really matter against the systematic favoritism that had defined my life? But every small success reinforced my resolve. Every subtle victory reminded me that I had agency. Every unnoticed detail I leveraged became proof that I could influence the story in ways they hadn't anticipated. By this point, I had also begun to understand a key principle. Timing was everything. I could expose everything immediately, but that would risk chaos, confrontation, and potentially failure. Instead, I practiced restraint, learning to wait for the right moment. Each small move, each minor adjustment, each clever observation was a test, an experiment in patience and control. I recall one evening when an opportunity nearly presented itself. My father, frustrated by my brother's negligence with household finances, muttered about consequences in the presence of relatives. For a fleeting moment, I considered revealing The ledger I had copied, exposing the pattern of favoritism and incompetence. But I didn't. I smiled politely, offered my help, and said nothing. That moment of restraint was deliberate. Timing, I knew, would magnify the impact when the full truth was eventually revealed. Instead, I waited. I watched. I gathered. Every interaction, every slip, every misjudgment by my family became part of a larger strategy. I realized that subtlety, patience, and intelligence could accomplish more than confrontation ever could. And slowly, the cracks grew. My brother's armor, once seemingly unbreakable, was not invincible. My parents' narrative of inevitability, once unquestioned, was beginning to wobble under the weight of small, consistent truths. Even in moments of outward normalcy, I felt empowered. A quiet confidence took root, replacing the helplessness I had carried for years. Every unnoticed action now had purpose. Every small shift was a step toward a larger reckoning. By the end of that season, the house was still outwardly normal. My brother strutted through his domain. My parents smiled with apparent control, and relatives continued their routines, oblivious to the subtle transformation taking place. But beneath the polished surface, the foundation was changing. The power they believed absolute was no longer so secure. And the most important thing? I was no longer waiting to be noticed. I had begun to act. Not with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, but with quiet, deliberate, intelligent steps. The storm was still silent, still unseen, but the pressure beneath the surface was building. The final step of this section came when an opportunity presented itself to confront them fully. A chance to expose the truth of favoritism, negligence, and manipulation. My brother's arrogance had created a perfect opening, a moment where revealing my knowledge could have caused immediate disruption. But I didn't act. I waited. Patience had become my greatest ally. Timing would ensure that, when the confrontation came, it would carry the weight it deserved. Every subtle shift, every clever move, every quietly built alliance and meticulously gathered piece of evidence was now leading to this moment of choice. I smiled to myself as I considered it. The moment would come. The balance of power was shifting, slowly, but undeniably. And when the time was right, the full truth would crash into their carefully constructed world like a tidal wave. For now, I remained quiet, invisible in their eyes, but growing stronger every day. Every small action I had taken, every unnoticed detail I had leveraged had built momentum. The storm was gathering, and soon they would see it. The day arrived without fanfare. No dramatic buildup, no warning signs, just the ordinary rhythm of the house, the usual casual conversations and clinking dishes. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen nothing unusual about me, nothing to hint that the storm I had been nurturing in silence was about to strike. I had waited for this moment for years, carefully planning, observing, and collecting every piece of evidence I needed. And now, the time had come. The setting was a family gathering, the kind that had once been unbearable. A room full of relatives, friends, and neighbors, all eager to celebrate some milestone of my brother's life. The air buzzed with casual chatter and laughter, and my parents moved through the room with their usual pride, confident in the image they had constructed. My brother, arrogant and self-assured, basked in the attention, unaware that the foundation, beneath him, was quietly cracking. I entered with the same composure I had maintained for months. Polite smiles, measured movements, eyes that seemed obedient but actually observed everything. I carried with me the ledger, the copies of contracts, the evidence of favoritism, mismanagement, and the hidden will that had started this journey. My pulse was steady, my mind clear. No fear, only purpose. It started subtly. A casual question here, a simple observation there. I was reviewing some of the old accounts, I began, my voice calm but deliberate. I noticed some interesting entries regarding transfers and expenses that were attributed solely to my brother. I'm curious, how did this happen? For a moment, confusion rippled across the room. My parents exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. My brother's confident smirk twitched, as if sensing a shift he didn't fully understand. I continued, moving slowly, deliberately, exposing one detail at a time, letting the room absorb each fact. I also came across copies of the family ledger, I added, placing the pages on the table for everyone to see. It shows payments, allowances, and assets that were consistently allocated to my brother, while my contributions and efforts were absent from any record. The silence was immediate and electrifying. Relatives shifted in their seats, glances exchanged, whispers rising. My parents' faces went pale, their composure cracking for the first time in years. My brother's eyes widened, a flicker of panic betraying the confidence he had carried so carelessly. I continued, each word carefully chosen. I've also reviewed documents, correspondence, and the last will. It confirms that the intention was always to allocate everything to him. There was a deliberate plan to exclude me entirely. The room was frozen. Every voice, every smile, every false assurance my parents had used to maintain control was gone. The truth, hidden for so long, now lay bare before them and everyone present. My brother tried to speak, to assert dominance, but his words stumbled. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. The laughter, the casual banter, the easy superiority he had always enjoyed evaporated instantly. He looked around, desperate for allies, but the eyes that had once admired him now reflected shock, doubt, and quiet judgment. My parents, stunned, tried to intervene, but it was too late. I had prepared meticulously, and the evidence spoke louder than any protest. The ledger, the contracts, the will, everything was visible, undeniable. No excuses, no justifications, no amount of charm could rewrite what had been meticulously documented. The humiliation was immediate. My parents' smugness crumbled into defensiveness, and my brother's arrogance dissolved into confusion and anger. The people who had once reinforced their narrative now saw the cracks in their facade. Whispers spread, questions rose, and the carefully constructed image of control and favoritism was dismantled piece by piece. I remained calm, measured, letting the truth do the work. My voice did not raise. I did not yell. I simply stated facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. Every word, every document, every small detail I had collected over months became a nail in the coffin of their assumed authority. As the room absorbed the revelation, I felt a surge of something I had not experienced in years: vindication. The power dynamic, once entirely in their hands, had shifted. I was no longer invisible, no longer a shadow to be ignored. The house that had been their stage was now a theater of truth, and I held the script. The most satisfying part wasn't just exposing the financial manipulation or the deliberate favoritism. It was watching the reality sink in for everyone present. The arrogance, the entitlement, the smugness, all the tools my parents and brother had used to dominate me, now recoiled under the weight of evidence. I looked around, taking in the faces of relatives who had once seemed indifferent. Their expressions now reflected a mixture of disbelief, sympathy, and recognition. I had been invisible for so long, erased from the narrative, and now I was undeniably present, and with presence came power. My brother, desperate to salvage pride, tried to assert his authority. "This isn't fair," he said, voice trembling with a combination of fear and anger. "You don't understand the responsibilities," I interrupted gently but firmly. "I understand perfectly. The responsibilities were visible, the errors documented, the favoritism clear. What was hidden was the assumption that I would remain silent. That assumption was wrong." The words landed like a hammer. My parents' faces tightened. My brother's shoulders slumped. The crowd, previously passive, began murmuring, questioning, seeking clarity. And I realized that the truth, once hidden, had a life of its own. It demanded recognition, and it could not be ignored. Every hidden act of injustice, every overlooked contribution, every carefully hidden favor to my brother, all of it had been revealed. And in that revelation, I found strength, dignity, and empowerment. It was cathartic, more than I had imagined. Years of resentment, humiliation, and invisibility were released in the form of truth. The narrative had shifted, not through confrontation or chaos, but through careful, deliberate exposure. I had reclaimed my voice, my place, and my right to be recognized. And yet, even in the glow of this victory, I realized something critical. This wasn't just about material gain. The will, the assets, the favoritism, they were all symbols, not the essence of my triumph. The real victory was intangible: dignity, agency, and the reclamation of my identity. I had been invisible, overlooked, and deliberately excluded, but I had found my strength. I had built patience into strategy, observation into action, silence into power. And now, standing in the room filled with witnesses, I understood that the most profound change was internal. The crowd began to shift. Some relatives whispered words of support, small nods acknowledging the courage it had taken to reveal the truth. Others, who had remained silent for years, now looked thoughtful, perhaps even reconsidering their past indifference. The family dynamics had changed irreversibly. The imbalance of power, once so absolute, was now a shared reality. My brother retreated, defeated not just by evidence, but by the undeniable truth of my capability and awareness. My parents, though still protective of appearances, were forced to recognize the failure of their carefully constructed plan. Every attempt at control they had relied upon was now undermined by the clarity of exposure. I allowed a small, measured smile. Not of gloating, but of recognition, of the truth I had long suspected and now had proven. Years of invisibility, humiliation, and calculated neglect had culminated in a moment that reshaped the narrative. I was no longer a shadow. I was present, powerful, and acknowledged. The day was not about revenge alone. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming agency in a world that had sought to deny me existence. It was about proving, both to myself and to those around me, that patience, strategy, and observation could transform vulnerability into strength. And as I watched my brother slump in quiet defeat, and my parents grapple with their failed strategy, I understood something crucial. The storm I had nurtured in silence had finally arrived. But it was not a storm of chaos. It was a storm of clarity, empowerment, and undeniable truth. I had waited, I had observed, and I had acted at the perfect moment. And in that perfect timing, I had turned the tables entirely. This was the culmination of years of hidden effort, strategic patience, and quiet strength. The house, once a stage for their dominance, had become a stage for truth. The power that had seemed untouchable was no longer absolute. The golden child, the smug parents, the orchestrators of my erasure, they were exposed, not with anger, but with undeniable clarity, and in that exposure I found something far more valuable than wealth or recognition. I found myself. The storm I had unleashed left ripples that extended far beyond that single family gathering. The fallout was immediate and undeniable. My brother, once untouchable, found himself confronted not only by the evidence I had revealed, but by the social consequences that followed. His arrogance, his carelessness, and his reliance on favoritism became painfully visible to everyone who had once admired him. The very people who had cheered for his every move now questioned his competence, his judgment, and his entitlement. He stumbled through responsibilities he had previously assumed were his by default. Invitations that once elevated him socially were quietly withdrawn. Family friends who had once praised him in polite admiration now asked pointed questions. His confident tone faltered, replaced by hesitation and uncertainty. Where he had thrived on attention and outward approval, he now faced scrutiny and doubt. The veneer of superiority he had relied upon for years cracked, revealing insecurity and inexperience beneath. Meanwhile, my parents confronted a different kind of consequence. Their pride, so carefully nurtured, had been shattered by exposure. Smugness gave way to shame, and control dissolved into guilt and fear. The carefully constructed narrative of favoritism, once unquestioned, was now laid bare for scrutiny. Their whispers and private justifications held little comfort when the Truth had been publicly displayed and verified. Relatives and friends, long aware of the imbalance, no longer ignored the reality. They saw it clearly and acknowledged it openly. The family dynamic shifted profoundly. Conversations that had once been dominated by my brother's achievements now included critical observations of his mistakes. The respect and deference my parents had assumed were permanent were challenged daily. I watched this unfold, not with cruelty, but with a calm sense of satisfaction. Justice, long delayed, had arrived. The invisible rules had been rewritten. For my part, the aftermath was both liberating and surreal. I no longer felt the invisible weight of neglect pressing against my shoulders. The constant need for approval, the desperate attempt to compete, silently with a favored sibling, had been replaced by clarity and self-possession. I began to organize my life around my own goals, ambitions, and values, independent of the approval or disapproval of those who had once held the power to define me. I rented my own space, a small apartment in the city, bright and filled with light. It was not grand, but it was mine. For the first time in my life, I arranged a home that reflected my choices, my personality, and my tastes. The walls were lined with books, the kitchen stocked with my favorite ingredients, and the atmosphere, imbued with a sense of calm and personal agency. The simplicity of this environment contrasted sharply with the tension and performative appearances of my family home. Financial independence, once a distant dream, began to take shape. I had been cautious with money, even when it felt like my efforts went unnoticed. Now I invested, saved, and grew resources that were entirely my own. Each transaction, each small step toward stability, reinforced my sense of control. The independence was tangible and empowering, a concrete manifestation of the reclamation of my life. Socially, I started building a network of connections based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than convenience or expectation. I reconnected with distant relatives who had quietly supported me, and I nurtured friendships that validated my worth. Unlike the hollow praise and favoritism I had endured for years, these connections were genuine. I realized that belonging did not require comparison or competition. It required authenticity. My brother's downfall was a quiet but persistent echo throughout this time. His mistakes, once overlooked, became widely acknowledged. Responsibilities he had failed to manage surfaced in ways he could not ignore. Friends and family members questioned his judgment and reliability. It was not vengeance that drove my satisfaction, but the recognition that accountability, long absent, was now unavoidable. The imbalance had been corrected, not by my aggression, but by the exposure of truth and the natural consequences it brought. My parents, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. The trust they had assumed was permanent was fractured. Their apologies were tentative and belated, but even genuine remorse could not erase the years of deliberate exclusion and favoritism. The lessons they had imposed, the manipulations they had conducted, and the assumptions of loyalty and compliance were met with my steady awareness and independence. Their influence, once absolute, was now diminished in ways both visible and subtle. Amid all this, I took deliberate steps to reinforce my own resilience. I engaged in projects that reflected my personal strengths, skills, and passions. Writing, volunteering, small entrepreneurial ventures, they were all avenues to demonstrate my capability and self-sufficiency. Each accomplishment, no matter how minor, served as a reminder that I was more than the sum of my parents' approval or my brother's privileges. Emotionally, the transformation was profound. The humiliation and invisibility that had defined my early life were replaced by a sense of dignity and self-respect. The anger and resentment that had fueled my initial plans for exposure had evolved into calm confidence and purpose. I no longer measured my worth against their validation. I measured it against my own integrity, effort, and growth. Family gatherings, once a source of dread, became spaces where I observed with measured detachment. I participated, yes, but without the compulsion to compete or seek approval. I engaged, authentically, allowing my presence to speak for itself. The power dynamic, long skewed in favor of my brother and parents, had been subtly inverted. I was now an equal participant, recognized and respected not because of favoritism, but because of deliberate action and demonstrated competence. There were moments of reflection, of course. I considered the years I had lost, the opportunities overlooked, the emotional labor expended in silence. But even these reflections became sources of motivation rather than regret. They reminded me of the resilience I had cultivated, the patience I had honed, and the strategic intelligence I had exercised to reach this point. My history of exclusion had shaped my strength, not diminished it. I also took care to maintain perspective. Justice, while satisfying, did not require vengeance. I did not seek to humiliate my brother beyond the natural consequences he faced. I did not attempt to punish my parents beyond the exposure of truth. My focus was on rebuilding, reclaiming, and reinforcing my own life. The satisfaction derived from their accountability was secondary to the primary goal: self-determination. 1. Of the most surprising developments was the response of others in our extended family and community. Some who had once turned a blind eye now approached me with admiration and curiosity. Their recognition was not the validation I had once craved. It was confirmation that my actions had produced meaningful change. I had demonstrated that strength, patience, and intelligence could alter long-standing power dynamics, and in doing so, I inspired recognition beyond what I had anticipated. I began to create routines that prioritized my well-being and personal growth. Exercise, mindfulness, and daily planning became anchors in a life that was increasingly self-directed. The physical and emotional spaces I occupied reflected the autonomy I had fought to secure. Each day reinforced the understanding that my life was mine to shape, not dictated by favoritism, neglect, or parental manipulation. The collapse of my brother's perceived invincibility and the disillusionment of my parents allowed me to redefine family relationships on my own terms. I engaged when I chose, withdrew when necessary, and maintained boundaries that protected my autonomy. These boundaries, once unthinkable, became essential to the ongoing renewal of my identity and agency. Financial, social, and emotional independence became intertwined in ways that strengthened the foundation of my new life. Every decision, every project, every interaction was informed by the knowledge that I no longer needed approval to justify my existence. The empowerment I felt was holistic, a result of strategic patience, deliberate action, and unwavering self-belief, and so, as the dust of exposure settled, I found myself standing in a space I had long imagined but only now inhabited. A life not tethered to their judgment, a world in which my contributions were recognized on their own merit, and a future shaped by my choices, not their favoritism. The collapse of the old order had made room for renewal. This period of rebuilding was not instantaneous. It was deliberate, methodical, and sustained. But every step forward reinforced a central truth. Dignity, agency, and self-worth are earned through perseverance, strategic intelligence, and a refusal to be defined by the biases of others. In the end, the aftermath was more than just consequence for my family. It was a personal renaissance. Where once I had existed as a shadow, I now moved through the world with autonomy and clarity. Where humiliation had once ruled, self-respect reigned. Where invisibility had constrained me, recognition, earned and authentic, flourished. And, as I looked toward the future, I understood that this was not the final chapter of struggle or growth, but a new beginning. The pieces of my life, once scattered and diminished, had been gathered, realigned, and strengthened. The justice that had been served externally had mirrored the internal victory I had achieved. In reclaiming what had been denied, I discovered that true power was not in wealth, approval, or position. It was in the ability to stand firm, to act deliberately, and to build a life rooted in authenticity and self-respect. The aftermath, far from being a period of chaos, became a season of renewal, a testament to resilience, strategy, and the quiet but undeniable strength of someone who refused to remain invisible. After the whirlwind of revelation, confrontation, and rebuilding, I found myself in a quiet, reflective space. The house, once filled with tension, judgment, and favoritism, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. The events that had defined my childhood, my invisibility, my brother's golden child, status, my parents' deliberate exclusion, were no longer anchors holding me back. I had reclaimed my voice, my space, and my dignity. Now it was time to understand what closure truly meant. Closure, I realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about severing ties in anger or seeking revenge for its own sake. Closure was about understanding the journey, acknowledging the pain, and redefining the terms on which I allowed family to exist in my life. I could not undo the years of favoritism or the public humiliation, but I could choose how much influence it had over my present and future. I started with myself. Every morning, I reminded myself that my worth had never been dependent on the validation of my parents or the applause of relatives. It had always been within me, waiting to be recognized, nurtured, and defended. The ledger, the evidence, and the public revelation had been tools, but the real victory was internal. I had cultivated patience, strategy, and self-respect. Those were permanent. Family gatherings, once a source of anxiety, became manageable. I attended selectively, participating when it was meaningful, withdrawing when it wasn't. I no longer measured my presence by my brother's performance or my parents' approval. Instead, I measured it by my own values: authenticity, respect, and mutual care. That simple shift in perspective transformed interactions that once left me drained into opportunities for engagement without compromise. I also began to redefine what family meant. It was no longer dictated solely by blood. Family became a combination of chosen connections, mutual support, and trust. Friends who had been consistent through my struggles, relatives who had offered quiet encouragement, and mentors who had guided me without judgment. All became central to my sense of belonging. I realized that love and loyalty were not automatically granted. They were cultivated, nurtured, and reciprocated. The emotional weight of betrayal, though present, began to dissolve. I acknowledged the hurt, the favoritism, the invisibility, the exclusion from inheritance and recognition. I recognized it fully, without minimizing or ignoring it. But I did not allow it to define me. Instead, it became a reference point, a reminder of resilience and strategic intelligence. Every act of exclusion had forged a part of my strength. Every silent observation had refined my ability to act deliberately. I forgave, not to absolve others of wrongdoing, but to release myself from the toxic grip of resentment. Forgiveness was not forgetting, it was reclaiming control. I did not have to condone the behavior, nor did I have to reconcile fully with those who had caused pain. I only had to acknowledge reality and decide how I would engage moving forward. That internal reconciliation became the cornerstone of my closure. Materially, life had changed as well. Independence was no longer a distant dream but a lived reality. I had my own home, financial autonomy, and professional accomplishments that were entirely self-driven. Each step forward reinforced the truth I had discovered. Control over my life was now mine, and it was sustainable. The wealth, the possessions, or the approval once allocated exclusively to my brother no longer mattered. I had created a world where my choices, effort, and determination defined success. In parallel, I noticed subtle changes in my family. My brother, once the embodiment of entitlement, now approached me with a mixture of curiosity and hesitance. My parents, once smug and confident, had moments of quiet reflection. But I understood clearly that their personal growth, or lack thereof, was not my responsibility. I had no need to micromanage their recognition of truth. My focus remained on my own growth and fulfillment. The shift from silence to voice, from shadow to presence, was complete. I no longer hesitated to assert myself when needed. My opinions were heard without fear of dismissal. My contributions recognized without compulsion. My boundaries respected without negotiation. These were not privileges granted by my parents. They were rights I had earned through patience, strategy, and self-respect. Emotionally, I felt a freedom I had never known. The invisible chains of favoritism, comparison, and exclusion had been broken. I could exist in spaces without fear of erasure, without the pressure to compete for attention, without the weight of being less than. The clarity that emerged was liberating. I had survived the manipulations, navigated the betrayals, and emerged stronger, wiser, and empowered. Even in moments of solitude, I felt complete. I could reflect on my childhood without bitterness, acknowledging both pain and growth. I understood that the narrative of my life had shifted, not because others had changed, but because I had. That realization was profound. The power to define myself, to choose who I allowed in my life and to act in accordance with my values, was a gift I had fought for and secured. I also embraced a sense of responsibility for the future I was building. Independence and empowerment were not static states. They required continuous nurturing. I committed to maintaining the boundaries I had established, cultivating relationships that honored mutual respect, and pursuing goals that reinforced autonomy and self-worth. The lessons of patience, observation, and deliberate action became guiding principles for navigating all aspects of life. At times, I reflected on the complexity of closure. It was not a single moment or dramatic act. It was a continuous process of reflection, recalibration, and growth. I could interact with my family without resentment, participate without compromise, and maintain distance without regret. Closure was not about erasing history. It was about mastering my response to it. I also recognized the importance of narrative. I began to tell my story, quietly at first, to friends, mentors, and eventually broader audiences. Sharing my experience became an act of empowerment, reinforcing my journey and inspiring others who faced similar struggles. The transformation from shadow to voice, from passive observer to active agent, was a testament not just to personal resilience, but to the capacity to reclaim dignity and define one's own life. With each retelling, I refined the understanding of what true family meant. Blood ties were part of the story, but connection, trust, and respect were the defining elements. I celebrated relationships that reflected these values, nurtured bonds that were reciprocal, and released those that were exploitative or harmful. My chosen family, constructed with care and intention, became a source of joy, support, and belonging. As months passed, the clarity of my journey settled into a deep sense of peace. I no longer dwelled on past grievances or the deliberate manipulations that had once defined my existence. Instead, I focused on growth, creativity, and contribution. The pain of betrayal had been transformed into purpose. The struggle for recognition had become self-affirmation. Even when I encountered my parents or brother, the dynamic was altered irrevocably. There was no hostility, only acknowledgement of reality. I interacted with composure, detached from the need for validation or revenge. Their influence on my self-perception had been neutralized. My worth, my agency, and my dignity were independent of their recognition. I began to mentor others who faced similar family challenges, sharing strategies for patience, observation, and empowerment. The lessons I had learned, the value of strategic silence, the power of subtle action, the importance of self-respect, became tools to help others navigate toxic dynamics. My story, once private and painful, became a source of hope, resilience, and inspiration. In private moments, I reflected on the irony. The very manipulations and exclusions that had caused so much pain had also cultivated skills, resilience, and strategic thinking that served me in ways I had never imagined. The adversity, though unjust, had shaped me into someone capable of deliberate action, thoughtful reflection, and confident independence. Ultimately, closure was not a single act, but a culmination of growth, understanding, and choice. I had reclaimed my life, defined my values, and established my own boundaries. I had discovered that freedom, dignity, and belonging are earned not by seeking validation from those who exclude you, but by cultivating self-respect, autonomy, and authenticity. I often thought about what my younger self would have said, seeing the adult I had become. The invisible, overlooked child would have been amazed at the transformation. The fear, frustration, and humiliation that had once been overwhelming were now lessons and catalysts for empowerment. The journey from shadow to self-possession had been long, but it had led to clarity and liberation. And so, my version of closure was complete. Not through vengeance, not through erasure, but through understanding, deliberate action, and the unwavering pursuit of autonomy. I defined family on my own terms, found belonging beyond imposed hierarchies, and built a life rooted in self-worth, resilience, and freedom. In the end, the past did not disappear, but its hold over me did. I had emerged from years of invisibility and manipulation stronger, wiser, and empowered. And that empowerment, quiet, steady, and undeniable, became the foundation for the life I now lived, a life of dignity, choice, and boundless possibility. Closure, I realized, was not an end. It was a beginning.